Walking a path along the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road to the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and why that wizard and that lion have been chatting with each other all evening. At a corner table by the fire are three people. One of them is, unprompted, explaining the difference between an Oxford Don and an Oxford professor. And that's me, Matthew Mellema, and welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to help connect you with the great story, the great stories, in our own stories in order to understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. So listeners, if you're the sort of person who listens to this podcast, which I guess by definition you are, then you're probably the sort who cares about the Christian imagination. I mean, it was literally just in the intro I read. And by caring about the Christian imagination in our contemporary context, that almost means by necessity that you care about the works of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. I'm joined by someone as my special guest host who I believe cares about both of these writers. That's my own brother, Brian Mellema. Brian, do you care about Lewis and Tolkien?
Absolutely, I do.
Well, there you go. I had a feeling you would say that. So, listeners, as a reminder, Brian joins us as a special guest host from time to time. He's also my creative collaborator. He was the illustrator on my book, Red Rex, which we've mentioned. Brian, I'm going to open with a very quick anecdote. Do you remember going to see Return of the King when we were kids?
Yes, that is one of my fondest memories.
Okay, so I'm several years older than Brian. We have a middle brother in between us. And me and the middle brother had already read the book, so we knew what was going to happen. But Brian, he didn't read it. He was a middle schooler. He was too busy. So we told him as a joke, it's like, Brian, Frodo's going to die in the middle of the movie. It's really sad. And because we knew there would be this scene when Sam thinks Frodo's dead, and we could look over to him like, hey. And that's the sort of high-quality nerd humor that you would get from high school me. But Brian, do you feel yourself as like odd or estranged from other Christian imaginers because of your Lewis Tolkien fandom?
I feel like that genre has been growing in the Christian realm for such a long time now. It feels like there's a lot of collaboration in areas.
Feel like there's a lot of company in the fandom, right?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Well, there's a reason for that. And I will say, speaking personally, obviously, I'm a huge fan of both Lewis and Tolkien. And again, because I host a podcast on the Christian imagination, that probably goes without saying, which is a fact that I find very interesting. How did these two Englishmen from the mid-20th century have such a profound impact on the Christian imagination? Or, for that matter, the world's imagination? Our guest today has sought to answer this question in a unique way. He's both a writer and a visual artist, and he leverages both of these talents for his new graphic novel, The Mythmakers. It tells the story of Tolkien, Lewis, and the worlds they created in a unique way. It combines passages of prose with gorgeous illustrations and narrative comic panels. Like, seriously, guys, if you're interested in the Christian imagination, Tolkien or Lewis, this graphic novel, The Mythmakers, is about the biggest no-brainer recommendation we can make. You will love it. That artist is John Hendricks, and we are so thrilled to have him join us at the pub table today. Thank you so much for joining us, John.
Hey, I'm glad to be here. I'll buy the first round.
All right, so let's start off with some logistics here, because this is a great problem for you to have. Your first printing of The Mythmakers is already sold out, is that right?
It's true. They did not make a small printing of this either, so that's a very good problem to have. But yeah, it definitely has found an audience. This book is written primarily for young audiences. That's what I think of as my target reader. But it's sort of escape containment, and a lot of adults have found that they're very interested in this subject and the way that it's presented. So yeah, that's really good news. If you're having trouble finding it, the second printing is on the way, so it should be in bookstores and Amazon and all those kind of places pretty soon.
Awesome. So yeah, like John said, listeners, by the time this gets posted, I'm guessing they've got the second printing in hand. But again, great problem to have if you're a writer. So I'm very happy that you have that problem,
Yes.
if you get what I mean. Um, so let's start off with some definitions here, because I do the writing. Brian, my brother, does the illustrating. You kind of
Mhm.
combine both of us. So do you consider yourself an author, an illustrator, or is like a graphic novelist just its own independent breed?
Well, when I talk about my work, I say that it has 100% words and 100% pictures. So, as you know, the book, the codex, is kind of the perfect human technology, in my opinion. And so that combination of words and images together is really pretty magical. So yeah, but I'm an accidental writer. I mean, I'm a person who started out drawing. That was my native language, and I learned that I needed to write to be able to make the kinds of books that I wanted to make, because I just was not going to sit around and wait for someone to write the great manuscript on John Brown or Dietrich Bonhoeffer, or the things that I was interested in drawing and thinking about. So I really am very self-conscious about my writing, because I think of it as um, a learned language in a way. So when anyone compliments my writing, I almost feel more pride about that than the drawing, because I've never really worried about that side of it, at least since I've been making books.
Okay, so you speak illustration as a native language, but you learned writing as a second language.
Yeah, but I'm afraid I still have an accent. So my accent is in visual metaphor, and my editor has to basically, in my first draft, scratch all of the mixed visual metaphors that I use, because I'm always trying to inject pictures into the writing, and it can be a little much.
I love that. So Brian, he is one of your people, the native illustrator. So I know, Brian, when me and you were talking about this, you you had some comments you wanted about the visual style. So let's start with that, because I'm a writer native. So illustration is my second. I'm not even going to say second language. I'm just trying to, like, I know a few words and phrases. But Brian, why don't you talk fluently in Illustrator to John for a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I appreciate that, because I have a bit of a jump, because Matt is fluent in the author writing side, and so I feel like he flexes that muscle for us in our creative endeavors that that he mostly
Yeah.
kickstart.
Well,
Um,
I got to see your
but
book at when I was at Hutchmood, and it's really really lovely. So yeah, that's a fun collaboration, and it's a really good example of kind of that word image gestalt that happens when you do it together.
Thank you, I appreciate
Well,
that.
thank you. We were not fishing for that, but we will happily take it. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So now let's talk about this particular medium. I find it fascinating. Again, as someone who's coming in as sort of a non-illustration native, because you have the chunks of text, the prose text, then you intersperse it with the big illustrations, and then like the cartoon panels, almost what most people recognize like comic panels.
Hmm.
How did you settle on that for this story? But you've also used it in previous works as well.
Yeah, I know. People think of it as a blended language, which it is, and it sits in the graphic novel section at Barnes and Noble, because they don't
Mhm.
have a graphic nonfiction. They don't have a blended graphic prose nonfiction, right? It doesn't. It really is sort of between genres, but
Hmm.
it's really, I make them because that's how my brain absorbs information best. And there are some things that in comics it would take you 20 pages to do
Mhm.
that is better in a piece of prose. Like a paragraph can do that better than comics, but there are some things that comics do a lot better than prose. And I just wanted a book. When I started doing Faithful Spy, I wanted a book that blended all those languages together, because, like, sometimes you need a map, sometimes you need a narrative comic sequence, sometimes you just need a brief summary explainer, or you need like things that are almost like charts. They're just, all these different visual languages do different kinds of jobs. And to tell a complex history story, you kind of need all of them, or at least
Hmm.
I need all of them. So that I'm making a book for the 12-year-old version of me that would have wanted to learn about these men or these subjects that I'm interested in this way.
I am
Um,
so glad you phrased it that way, because I will tell you, when I was preparing for this podcast, I was going through and I was like, what should I even call this? Is it a graphic novel? Like that was the word I settled on, but didn't feel quite right. So I'm glad you the author also agree it's kind of genre bending in a really great way. So now let's get to the topic of it, because like you mentioned, you've done uh, historical narratives before, Faithful Spy among others. What made you settle on Tolkien and Lewis for this project? What in particular drew you to them?
Well, I mean, it starts out as just fan art. I mean, I'm such
Mm-hmm.
a fan of these men, and they meant so much to me and my work. I really don't know who I would be as an artist without them. And as a Christian, I think they validated imagination in such a
Mm-hmm.
real and poignant way in my childhood, both just as experiencing the stories, but then in my young adulthood, as reading about them and how they thought about their work, which I did not experience that part of their thinking until later. So I had been inside
Mm-hmm.
of their work and loved it. And then I came to read about how they made it and why they made it. And the richness of that was something that I've always thought someone should do a graphic novel, not of Narnia and Middle Earth, but of that third thing they subcreated together, which was, we often call the Inklings, which was really just the mythology of their friendship is so big that it
Mm-hmm.
really is another fantasy world that they created together. And I just always wanted to see that illustrated. And so that was where the concept came from. And I had been kicking it down the road for years. Just I wasn't sure how to do it. It's very challenging as a graphic novel because the Inklings, they never did anything. They just talked in pubs, and like 300 pages of that is just kind of not interesting. So I needed a framework to make it fun to draw, basically.
No, that totally makes sense. I can picture like the graphic novel where it's like, and here's another panel of Tolkien sitting at a pub talking, and here's Lewis
Yes.
sitting at a pub.
Yeah. I just
But
read this amazing graphic novel biography of Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormons, that also from
uh-huh.
my publisher, Abrams. And it's a really long biography. But like, again, like someone like Joseph Smith has all this stuff that happened in his life. He moved, there was violence, there was,
Mm-hmm.
anyway, like with the Inklings, there was World War One. That's about the most action sequence you can get inside of this
Yeah.
story. And then they're in Oxford thinking, writing, and talking for the next 50 years. So, yeah, it was a challenging story to come up with to make exciting to a 14-year-old.
Yeah, and I can't wait to get into that process because I think the way you went about it is so fascinating. But there's one point you mentioned earlier on that I want to focus on for a bit, and it's coming to Lord of the Rings, Narnia as a child, and then reappraising them as an adult. And Brian, I know you did this firsthand because, again, as your older brother, I have these advantages over you. I remember we kept trying to get you to read Lord of the Rings as a middle schooler, and we had this running joke because you read the first chapter like 20 times but never made it through. Did you eventually make it through? What was your appraisal going through it as an adult as opposed to trying to get through it as a kid?
Yeah, that the joke is that is very true. I did read the first chapter like 20 times. But thankfully, I discovered audiobooks and that made me get through them much quicker. I did read the actual books too, but yeah, going through them as an adult is just a much different experience because I can appreciate kind of the richness and the depth of it as 12-year-old me could not. But
Yeah.
I loved the movies. So,
You, you just couldn't deal with that long expected party. But
no.
let's talk about the
It's
research.
funny. I struggled to read The Hobbit as a kid, but
Mm,
I wanted to read it so bad because the
Yeah.
copy I had was the Michael Haig illustrated one, and it had this
Mhm.
beautiful painting of Smaug on the cover, and I carried it
yeah.
around with me like it was a Bible, honestly. But I remember I just was it was hard for me to read. I really struggled with reading as a young person. So the illustrations were like an oasis in the desert. So like I'm
Mhm.
getting through text that like I'm struggling to understand, but then I get to a picture and it was like, oh, finally I know what's going on. I can see it. And so yes, I think a lot of kids learn how to read
Mhm.
through challenging fiction like this that they don't know why, but they're possessed to like get through it in some way.
Yeah.
No, I
Yeah.
think that's a absolutely great point because especially at that age where you're describing, John, right? I think having the challenge books is so important
Yeah.
because it's sort of thing like if you're left to your own device, you might not do it because you had this rewards like I really want to know the story. I
Yeah.
want to make sense of these amazing illustrations. That pushed you to do something which was probably really good for you as a middle grade kid.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I've heard 10-year-olds have been reading this book, which they're a little below the target audience for this,
Yeah.
but not by much, but definitely a 10-year-old, this is a challenging book for them. And
Hmm.
I have talked to a surprising number of 10-year-olds who have read this and got 80% of it,
Yeah.
honestly. And like they can come back and read it again and again. Like this is a book that will push them to try to grasp things that when is a 10-year-old going to sit down and read a treatise about the history of mythology, right?
Hmm.
But you can get them in the front door with a lion and a wizard that are on a dungeon crawl, and like that's kind of interesting.
No, absolutely. I think that again, parents, grandparents, and again, this is such a no-brainer recommendation. If you want to push your 10-year-old or 12-year-old older to get into this is the perfect entryway to do it.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
so now let's talk a little bit about your research process because like you've hinted, this topic has been explored before, not in this way though.
Yeah.
So what was your process of researching and was there anything in particular during your research that you're like, oh, I never knew that. That was super interesting.
Yeah, there's no question when you start a project like this, there's a gazillion books on these guys, and for good reason. So it's
Mhm.
easy to think, what can I possibly bring to this? Like, how do I add something to the canon of what this means to people? And so to me, it was really the audience, translating this for the particular audience. And I mean, news alert. Like adults also need help learning things. Very few adults actually want to sit down and read a 400-page book about the Inklings, even if they love the Inklings, because
Mhm.
that is a challenging medium, and we just don't have the capacity to read like we used to as a society. And so, yes, as I started the research on this, what I was wanting to do was just immerse myself in secondary scholarship. And I think of myself as just an amateur expert on these subjects that I write about. I just know like a little bit more than the reader. Like I've read like maybe 3 more books than you have about them, and that's all it is. But what I do is translate that and synthesize that into a whole that maybe you can't have access to if you don't have the time to read all these big works.
Yeah, absolutely. And now let's get to the way you set out the narrative again. One thing in particular I wanted to ask you about is the lion and the wizard, who have all this back and forth. There's sort of these characters you have to sort of drive the plot. Where I mean, I can guess where the wizard and the lion came from,
No, just
listeners,
no,
of
they're
course. But
chosen in random.
why'd you settle on that as a storytelling device?
Well, I wanted some avatars to help guide the reader. And I wanted them to sort of be inside the story, but not of the story. And so they're these um, they're kind of these guardians that walk through the tale with you. And I thought about, I mean, with Lewis, of course, I'm thinking of a lion. With Tolkien, I was wondering, is it an elf? Is it a king? Is it some kind of warrior? Is it, but once I got to Wizard, I felt like Lion and Wizard also just visually had a kind of Abbott and Costello visual effect to them. So it was just right to have them sort of operate and actually, people have asked me, like, oh, you did that because you don't have the rights to those named characters. And that's true. I can't use Aslan and Gandalf, but honestly, I don't want to use them because they contain a kind of idea and story that is separate from what I want to do. And in this story, I just needed them to function as like Tolkien and Lewis are inside of a kind of holding space, not a purgatory, but they're like sorting through their life together before they enter the new creation. And the book serves as a kind of journey, and I wanted to create a myth about them. Right. So the quest part of the book needed 2 protagonists that were kind of not inside the story itself, and that's the conundrum I had about how to tell this tale the right way.
Yeah, and let's talk about the myth making in particular, because that's something both of them are known for. Tolkien, especially with his world building, but also Lewis. Wh- What what was it about their world building, their myth making that you think clicked so much with the world, because I think we don't realize here after they've had their effect how much of an effect they have had. So tell us a little bit about the impact that their myth making has had on later fiction and later writing.
Yeah, I mean, I call the book The Myth Makers because in title it looks like it's referring to them, but it's really
Mhm.
about all humanity, and I'm
Mhm.
including God in that category of myth maker as well. So yes, Tolkien and Lewis were building on basically the most ancient of questions: is where do stories come from, and what are they trying to do? And so the book attempts to give a very thumbnail account of where myths come from, what the function of myths were, and why Lewis and Tolkien were obsessed with the kind of joy that those myths created in their hearts, and that they were on a quest to sort of recreate that and to find that activity as a doorway into a larger meaning about the world, right? They believed that mythology and stories were a kind of secret elvish that God gave us to learn things that we can learn in no other way, right? And so Tolkien believed that um, myth making was actually a holy act, because the highest form of human art is what he called it, because we are creating in our minds ex nihilo, from nothing, the way God does in the world. And so we are imaging God when we make world building fantastical fantasy stories. And so they just saw this as a kind of worshipful act, and it did these things that allows humanity to have escape, to have recovery, to have consolation, and to ultimately give them a way to understand how we escape death, right? And that's the ultimate human longing. So all those things are part of what mythology does for us and why they were so interested in it. I mean, for Tolkien, what he wanted to do was create a mythology for England, because of course people will think, oh, well, King Arthur, they had King Arthur, but those were the romantic tales. Those were from
Mhm.
France. Those were the chivalric romances. And Tolkien never believed those were English.
Yeah.
And he wanted something that had the core of his homeland at the center of it. I mean, the Shire is his love letter to England and to
Mm.
the place where he grew up when he was younger.
Yeah, that is so fascinating on so many levels, because one of the things that I think we oftentimes just falls to the back of our minds is that both Lewis and Tolkien were professors, right? They were academics. Like Tolkien, especially, was a professor of what was like Anglo-Saxon literature or something like that.
Hmm.
And I find it fascinating that so many academic types, not all of them, but so many have this tendency to like, they get super into their field, but then stop looking at the broader implications. But he looks at this like, hey, the things we see in Beowulf, the things we see in the Norse sagas, these have broader implications about God and his creation in the world. And he sought to do something about it, which is something that actually had an impact. An academic who took his subject matter so seriously that he changed the world. Um,
Well, and they both were not planning on doing that. It was an accident, you know. I mean, that's
mhm,
the other astonishing thing about their little hobby they did together was they sold 250 million copies, um, kind of accidentally. I mean, they re-enchanted an entire um, world on basically a coin flip and a dare to try to write things that they wanted to read for adults that took fantasy and imagination, the horns of Elfland, as they said, took that very seriously. And yeah, that's shocking when you think about it. Like that, that not only did one of them do that, but they both did that together.
mhm.
And it's I think you can make the book tries to make an argument that um, neither of them would have had their careers and their work without the other. They needed the other person to help them complete their story. I mean, just as Galadriel gives a gift to Sam and Frodo that they don't understand, but they will need at the moment, the very moment they need the thing the most, they've been given it. And
Mhm.
that's what Lewis and Tolkien did for one another. And yeah, it is a myth. It's a myth waiting to be retold.
Absolutely. And I want to get to the relationship between Tolkien and Lewis in just a bit, but first I want to linger on something else you mentioned. That's about how one of the effects, and again, we don't think about this just because we live in the after Lewis Tolkien world.
Right.
But prior to them, it wasn't really considered something that grown-ups did to read fantasy. Whereas now, like, hey, Brian, I happen to know about your reading habits. You read a lot of fantasy books, don't you?
I do.
What kinds? Let's list them.
I mean, like I said, I'm a big audiobook guy, but yeah, I like a lot of like middle grade fantasy too, because they're a lot easier to listen to and track because there's not so many crazy names going on. But
Yeah. Well, middle
yeah,
grade, more adults should read middle grade.
I
It's
agree.
usually written not for simplicity, but for clarity. And
Yes,
it's a really easy way to get rich storytelling. So yeah, everyone should read middle grade fiction.
That is
agreed.
something we can all agree on.
Yeah.
But yeah, like the point being though, Brian, like you are an adult, you have
Mhm.
children, you have a job, a mortgage, all of that, and you are openly reading fantasy, right? And
Absolutely.
that is something in the pre-Tolkien Lewis days that would have been considered kind of weird, right? Because fantasy literature in that time, like the Victorian, early Edwardian era, was kind of stuff for little kids, but they made it something that you could be a respectable grown adult and really enjoy. That kind
Yeah.
of a weird secondary effect, right, John?
The first adult book of fantastical or fairy stories is generally considered to be Phantastes by George
Mm,
MacDonald, which was very important to Lewis. But there were some early examples of sort of world building fantasy for adults. The polymath William Morris, who we know for his like
mhm,
wallpaper, basically, also wrote these incredible fantasy books. I mean, he was an incredible artist, writer, thinker, poet. Um, and then a man named Edison wrote this book called The Worm Ouroboros that they had read and that affected them. There was a writer, Lord Dunsany, who wrote some sort of, they were like high medieval sort of story. So there were these like proto little blips on the radar,
mhm,
but those were occurring alongside things like The Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland, right? So the
mhm,
ones that we remember from this era are meant for children, right? That's what it comes out of that late 1900s or late 1800s, early turn of the century literary period. And so the thing that Tolkien and Lewis did was really turn the key on, okay, what if we wrote this sort of high epic fantasy that is for adults and that was extremely accessible and popular, right?
mhm.
And that was the thing that they changed. And really, now we can't even think of a world. I mean, when I talk to young people about this, I'm like, the books that you guys read that have dragons and knights and
Mhm.
fairies and magic in them, this not that long ago, this was not available. You know, like this is a sort of new genre that Lewis and Tolkien sort of unlocked.
Absolutely, and just the effects are so wide ranging that's it's kind of shocking. Like even like something like video games, like RPG, like role player games, like Legend of Zelda, Fire Emblems, like Link and
Yeah,
all those guys. They originally took a lot of their inspiration, sort of the way that the mechanics worked from Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons, in turn, took a lot of its assumptions, mythology, world building from Lord of the Rings.
yeah.
So it's not crazy to say that J.R.R. Tolkien is kind of the grandfather of modern video game RPGs,
Oh
which is
yeah,
crazy, but it's also true.
yeah. Oh no, Hunter, you can draw a straight line. Ursula K. Le Guin,
Mhm,
Star Wars, Dune, George R. R. Martin, obviously, like all of these things that we take as sort of granted for being really genre changers in their own right. They can
mhm.
all go back to Tolkien and ultimately Lewis. I mean, Lewis, of course, wrote the space trilogy on this famous coin flip he did with Tolkien. And the cool thing about that is like that Tolkien and Lewis were very interested in science fiction as a
Mm.
category. Um, and so it would be interesting, what would Tolkien have wrote if he got if the coin flipped the other way and he had gotten space travel? I mean, I kind of think, I mean, on some level, he might have written like Star Wars, like
Mhm.
I think it
Yeah.
would have been the same epic, because Star Wars is mythology. It's not science fiction, right? Like it's a different thing than Star Trek. But again, like that era that Tolkien became a fantasy mega hit in America in the 60s ran right alongside Star Trek. And those two things together basically invented fan culture, of what we know of as fan culture, which is not just like, hey, I enjoyed that story, but I identify with that story and I want to be inside of it. I want to make it part of what I think about myself in the world.
No, absolutely. And again, that is so ubiquitous in today's world. It's like we're a bunch of fish that don't realize we're in the water that Lewis and Tolkien
It's
created.
true. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're running low on time, but final question I wanted to ask you. It's something you've touched on already, but it's the value of community for creating the art. Obviously, me and Brian, we work together on lots of projects. I'm involved with the Anselm Society. Now you've done a lot of work with the Rabbit Room, so community is important to all of us. But talk about the value of community to Tolkien and Lewis and how them together, them with the rest of the Inklings helped enrich their work.
Well, I think I'll start out by saying there is a kind of liturgy in our world that tells us that artists are loners and basically selfish and navel gazers, and you're kind of a drag on society. I think even starving artist as a category, okay, all these things influence the way artists think of themselves in the world. And they have been taught, I think, that their work is most special as their own, right? As opposed to relying on the power of community. And our work always gets better in community. It does not get worse. And so you see that in the work of the Inklings and specifically Lewis and Tolkien themselves. But I think countering this notion of like, my best ideas, if I share them, someone will steal them, or someone will pollute them, or someone will not, they will not be as authentic and as mine if I let others make them better with me. And that's just a false idea. And as a person who has chaired a graduate program at WashU in illustration, I work with a lot of young artists and writers. And the secret sauce of graduate school is community. It's not the teacher telling you things that you didn't know. It's not me imparting information to them. It's the community that is seeing someone's work, restating it to them, and helping them to make it better, helping them to see it for what it is, not what they intended it to be. And almost all artists need other people to make their work flourish.
I love that. And that is a great note to close out this program on. So before we go, again, John Hendricks, the Mythmakers is the book that is out immediately. And again, guys, seriously, this is the most obvious recommendation I can make. If you listen to this program, you're going to like it. So just go out and buy it. But John, where else can we find you? Where else can we find the rest of your work?
Well, online, I'm generally at John Hendricks on Instagram and all the social things. So, check me out there. I'm working on a new book right now, which is a follow-up to my drawing book, Drawing is Magic, which is a drawing book where you draw in the book itself about how you not just draw heads or hands or horses, but how you generate ideas. So that book has been out 10 years next year. And so I'm doing a follow-up on that called The 100 Things List.
Awesome. That is also, Brian. If that would have come out when you were a kid, Brian, that would have been the perfect Christmas present for you, wouldn't it? That was like your childhood.
Myself as a child.
Love it.
Yeah, I'm slowly learning. You and my brother had like the exact same childhood, so I feel like I really get you now, John. That's really great.
Yes.
So. Once again, John Hendricks, The Mythmakers, thank you so much for joining us. And listeners, as you can tell, things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire is down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. If you have an extra 30 seconds or so, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.